We're here this morning. Well, I'm here this morning with Alana from Become an Entrance Exam Tutor, and she's here to talk about all things entrance exam related. So we have had some questions sent through in advance that Alana will be answering. But if you've got any other questions, feel free to post those in the comments. There is a slight delay between you sending your comment and it coming through to us. So if we don't answer it straight away, I'll be keeping a track of all the questions, which we will then answer at the end. So please don't think we've ignored your question. If you do ask one, we will come back to it. But sometimes there's just a little delay between you actually hitting send and the question coming through. But hello, Samantha. Good morning to you as well. And I will hand over to Alana to introduce yourself, because you can do it so much better than I can.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you for having me today. I'm Ilana King. I am a teacher. I've been in education for over 25 years, and for the last 12 years, I've been an entrance exam tutor. I have a particular specialism in 7+ because when I was teaching, I worked with reception age children, and I sort of love that age group, but I also teach for 11+ as well, and 8+ for that matter. I started Become an Entrance Exam Tutor because 12 years ago, when I became an entrance exam tutor, there was no information for me, there was no help for me. I was kind of thrown in at the deep end and just needed to find my way. And I did find my way, and all tutors can find their way, but I felt that it would be great if there was a little bit of help out there for those who wanted to do it. So I set up Become an Entrance Exam Tutor to provide that information, the training, the help, the support that people are looking for. Okay, so Beth very kindly sent me all of the questions that had come in before today, and I've kind of grouped them into what I think is a logical order, and I'm going to go through them the best that I can, and if I miss any and somebody has a question, then please do just post it. But I wanted to start with the question that needs to start all of this off, which is, how do entrance exams work? That was one of the questions, and I think we'll start from that basic. So entrance exams are a selection process for entry into either independent schools or grammar schools. And they're used across the country, but they're used in different ways across the country. And I will answer that a little bit later. They're generally made up of a series of written tests, as well as an in-person interview assessment type stage. And how that happens varies slightly from area to area and school to school. So the follow-on question from that fits very nicely is, what is the difference between 7+, 8+, 11+, 13+? We hear all these kind of numbers thrown out there. What do they actually mean? What is it all about? So the 7+ assessment is a selection exam used only by independent schools, and it is used in different areas of the country. You will hear it most in London. There's a very, very large 7+ market in London, but it is used in other areas. Namely, Manchester has a 7+ process, and it's sort of spreading. It's not always called 7+. It might be called just entrance exam into year 3 for a private school, but it's essentially the same process. It is the process for gaining entry into year 3 of a private school. But it's actually a bit of a funny term, because when we hear 7+, we assume that all the students who are taking it are 7, and they're not. So many of the students who sit the exam will still be 6 years old, and that's because it's taken partway through year 2. Depending on the area, it'll be different, but generally in the around November, December of year 2. So a lot of the children are still 6 years old when they take this exam. Depending on the area and the school, so if we're thinking about some of the more competitive schools in London, as many as 16 children per place at the school, per available place, can sit the exam. So we're talking about a lot of competition. Now, that's not going to be true everywhere across the country, but certainly in the top schools in London, that is the case. And it's made up of written assessments, so tests in maths, English, and reasoning, and then a second stage process as well. The 8+ exam is essentially the same thing, but it's taken a year later. It's for entry into year 4. It's taken in partway through year 3. Now, the 8+ if we think of 7+ is niche, which it is, it's my niche and I love it, 8+ is really niche. 8+ is like a niche of a niche because there aren't many schools that do it. It's primarily, again, centered around London. And even in London, there's a very small number of schools that do an 8+ process, and it's often for boys rather than girls. But it's essentially the same process, just a year later. And then 11+, which I think is the exam that most people know about, and it's the most widely sat. So it's the one where people think, oh yeah, I know what 11+ is. But 11+ means something different depending on whether you're talking about independent schools, whether you're talking about grammar schools, whether you're talking about schools in different areas. It's actually quite a diverse exam. But it is essentially the same process, and that we're talking about entry into school. But at 11+, we're talking about entry into year 7, into secondary school. We can be talking about private schools. We can be talking about grammar schools. So where we're talking about 7+ and 8+, anything at primary level, there's no state equivalent. We're only talking about private schools. When we come to 11+, we actually have different kinds of 11+, which will include entry to grammar schools, which are state schools rather than independent schools. They're looking for academically able children. So the 11+ is a selection process to find those academically able students to go into these schools. And again, it happens the year before, so it happens in year 6 that they take the exam. For independent schools, it's generally later than it is for grammar schools. So for grammar schools, it can be quite early in the first term. For independent schools, it's later. It tends to be around December, early January. Again, it's going to vary school to school, but a little bit later. And again, it's a written, I'm going to come back to that, written in quotes, but because actually it's not always written, but written test initially, and then a second stage usually. Not all grammar schools have that second stage. Some do in the more competitive areas, so it does depend. Now, the reason I put written in quotes is because it's not always written. So up until more recently, for grammar schools, most grammar school areas were using a multiple choice format test that was either set by GL exam board or CEM exam board. And private schools could use something like that, but many actually had their own written tests that they had written for them or that they wrote themselves. So we're talking about paper-based, but there's also a third kind, which is the ISEB pretest, which is a computer-based test. The ICB pretest is only used for private schools, not state schools. But, and there's a big but here, CEM, who provided the multiple choice papers for lots of grammar school areas, have announced that they're no longer providing that format. They're moving to an on-screen format, which is like the ISEB. So when I say written, more school is written in the sense that it's reading, not necessarily written in the sense that it is written on paper anymore. It does vary area to area. So when we say 11+, we have to be a little bit careful that we're not talking about one homogenous thing. You often see people say, oh, how do I prepare for 11+? Well, that's going to really depend on what 11+ we're actually talking about.
Go on,
Dan.
That's such a key thing, isn't it? The 11+, as you've just said, encompasses so many different forms, and I think we will come on to that later. I know it's in the questions later on as well, so I'm sure you'll talk about that later too. So
absolutely. So there's so much detail in all of this, and I'm just trying to kind of give an overview. And just to finish the overview, this is not my area, 13+. I don't teach for 13+ at all. But just to give you a quick overview, 13+ is the selection for entry into year 9. Again, this will only be private schools. So state schools don't have this. No grammar for state, we're literally only talking about grammar school entry at 11+. There isn't any other. So it's sometimes called the common entrance exam. You might have heard it under that word rather than 13+. And it's a little bit of an odd one in that students have to actually be registered 1 to 4 years ahead. So a parent has to have actually made the decision quite far in advance that their child's going to sit the common entrance. And the pre-testing, which is often in the form of the ISEB pretest, happens 2 or 3 years before. So around the same time as 11+. But it's for entry at 13+, because within the private school system, some schools go all the way through to that point, and then they don't have a another school that goes beyond 13 and students move out. So I think it's less common. So if we're thinking about 11 plus, if we think about 7 plus, 8 plus, 11 plus, 13 plus, 11 plus is the one that is most common, that you're going to come across the most in different areas of the country, and most likely to be asked to tutor for. 7 plus, 8 plus, 13 plus are smaller markets, and they're more niche. So with 13 plus, there's also so with everything else, we're talking about English, maths, and reasoning. With 13 plus is also science, and sometimes I think even more than that. So it's kind of delves into other areas. But with everything else, as a tutor, you're thinking about English, maths, and reasoning. So it's kind of easier in the sense of what those subjects are that you've got to do. Where you go into 13 plus, it becomes more specialized. So it's an area that I don't work in personally, but I mean there are tutors who do. The third question that kind of fit with that group was, where do the exams actually take place? So given what I just said about sort of private schools and state schools, I think it's a really good question, because it does vary. So for 7 plus and 8 plus exams, always the student goes to the target school. Right. So if they are sitting a particular school, there'll be a date that they go to that school, all the children together in a big hall, right? And they sit the exam. So it's never at their own school. It's always going to be at the school that they're targeting. With 11 plus, that is also true, unless they are sitting the ISEB pretest, and the ISEB pretest can be done at their own school. But there's always an if and a but in all of this. So the but, if they're at a state school, the state schools will not facilitate that. So if they're at a private prep school, most private prep schools will facilitate that at their own school. So they're sitting at their own school. But for a state school student, they will have to arrange to go to the target school to actually sit the test, and arrangements are made for that. So that's fine. So there's a little bit of kind of variation, but primarily they're going to go to the school. And keeping in mind, for private schools, they're going to do multiple tests. So let's say they're applying to 5 different private schools. They're going to go and sit 5 sets of exams on 5 different days at 5 different schools. The ISEB pretest they do once, and for grammar schools it's by area. So let's say they're in Kent, they're going to sit it once for Kent, but be able to apply to the different grammar schools. So the number of times that they sit an exam is going to vary, but it's also going to be different. Many students who sit for grammar school will also sit for independent school. So they're going to sit the grammar school exam, and they're going to sit the independent school exam. So there's a lot of testing that goes on in that period. Right. I'll take a breath. So that was the first set of questions, just around what are these exams? What are we actually kind of talking about? The next set of questions are more about the exams themselves. What's tested? What do they look like? What are the exam conditions like? Are they different kinds of tests at different schools, which we've covered a little bit already, but so I'm going to talk about that now. So what's tested? And I'm afraid that for me, I'm going to have to focus entirely on 7 plus, 8 plus, and 11 plus. I gave you the quick overview of 13 plus, but I have no experience of 13 plus, so I'm not going to be able to delve into that. So we're going to really only talk up to 11
That's
plus.
absolutely fine.
Okay.
Still plenty to cover.
Yes, I think there's enough. So what's tested in the entrance exam? Well, essentially the same thing is being tested regardless of what exams we're talking about and what level we're talking about. It's English. And English is in not two areas, more than, I'll come back to that. It's English, it's maths, and it's reasoning. Okay, so there are very few exceptions to that. There are always exceptions. I know of some schools that don't do reasoning at 7 plus. I know of some schools that when we're talking about reasoning, we're talking about non-verbal and verbal. Some schools will do non-verbal, not verbal. There is very rarely the other way around, but I know some that are the other way around that only do verbal and not non-verbal. There's always exceptions. So you've got to do your research. You have to know, if you're talking about tutoring children for specific exams, you have to know where they're sitting, what schools they're sitting for, do your research in those schools and find out exactly what format those tests are going to take. But generally, it's maths, English, and reasoning. Within that, there can be variation, but the skills being tested are pretty much the same. So in English, comprehension is going to be a big part of it. Vocabulary is going to be a big part of it. Spelling and grammar will form a part of it. How it forms that part of it is going to vary by test. So what do I mean by that? Well, for instance, if it's a private school that has their own written exam, they may have a comprehension paper. So read a passage, answer written out questions. So talk about actual sentences on lines as against multiple choice. Or it could be a multiple choice exam where they're answering comprehension, but through multiple choice questions. When we're talking about vocabulary, that vocabulary could be tested just within the comprehension paper in the sense that there are vocabulary words in the passage that are tricky and they're asked their meaning or synonyms or things like that within the questions. Or it could be explicitly tested on a multiple choice exam where they literally have, here's the vocabulary word, here are 4 choices, which is the antonym, which is the synonym, which is the definition, and it's being tested that way. Vocabulary is also tested through the writing portion of the exam. Not all schools have a writing portion of the exams. Lots of grammar schools do not, but independent schools almost always do. So they have a creative writing, not always creative writing. It can be descriptive writing, persuasive writing. I know of a couple of schools that do a combination of the two. So it's a writing element, but that writing element is also going to be testing vocabulary in that the student needs to be using really mature vocabulary in their writing. Same with spelling and grammar. Spelling and grammar can be tested explicitly in questions, but it can also be tested implicitly through the answers that are being written onto the paper. So that's kind of the English side. Now we have 7+, we have 8+, 11+. I'm talking about all of them. All of these things are tested right down to 7+. The level, obviously, that's being tested is going to be different at 7+ than 11+. But absolutely, they are testing vocabulary, comprehension, writing, grammar, spelling, right down to those 6-year-olds who are sitting those early exams. For maths, it's maths. It's not any kind of special maths. It's maths. It's curriculum maths. So depending on the level, 7+, 8+, 11+, it's the maths from the curriculum. But it goes beyond what you think it does. So this is the area that you've got to be a bit careful. Schools will say we test. So for example, for 11+, we test maths up to the Key Stage 2, end of Key Stage 2 curriculum. Not true. They lie. They go beyond. So whatever age you're looking at, so if you're talking about 7+, our year 2 children, they will need to know some maths that goes into year 3. Not all of year 3, but some maths that goes into year 3. If we're talking about 8+, they will need to know some maths that goes into year 4. If we're talking about 11+, they will need to know some maths that goes into year 7. So you're going beyond, and keeping in mind that they're taking the exam very early in the year, you're actually going beyond what they've been taught in school at that point, because there's a whole rest of that year and into the year above. So there is a lot of maths content that has to be covered for the maths portion of the exam. And again, the maths can be different formats as well. So that varies. And then reasoning, verbal and nonverbal reasoning. It's going to vary by school. Verbal and nonverbal reasoning will always be multiple choice. So whether it's on screen or on paper, it's going to be multiple choice. But the schools, there are so few schools that don't do nonverbal. You can pretty much guarantee you're going to have nonverbal. Most will do verbal as well, but again, there's going to be a few exceptions to that. So it's worth checking, and that's essentially it. Those are the format. Let me just check questions again. I think I said what's in it, what do they look like? Okay, the third question that fell within that is, are the testing conditions different depending on the age? So more informal for young children, more formal for older? No. I wish I could say the answer to that was yes. The answer is no. Those 6-year-olds go in, they sit in a hall, and they're given papers. They finish those papers under test conditions, time conditions. They go off and play for a bit. They come back, they do another one. So, the short answer is no, it's not informal. These are formal written tests under formal test conditions. Okay, I think that covered that section, Beth.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the conditions are a big thing, aren't they? Especially for a child who is 6 or 7. It's the first time they've encountered that as well. So not only is it the content you might want to work on in the sessions with you, but also how they might prepare for what they're going to experience, because it's probably quite different to what they've experienced at school so far.
Absolutely. So unless these young children in particular are at a pre-prep that is prepping, so we're back to kind of, the differences now. So in private schools, you can have a pre-prep. So these are the schools that only go up to year 2. Everybody leaves after year 2. There's less of those around now. A lot of what used to be pre-preps are now expanding and going full prep. But I have students who are at pre-preps. Those schools are preparing for 7+. At school, they're doing test conditions, but they're in the minority. The vast majority of children are either at a state school where they're certainly not sitting exams like this, or they're at a prep school that goes all the way through, and therefore they're not prepping for 7+ because they don't actually want the students to leave. So those children have never really sat a test in that. I mean, they'll do a spelling test at school or things like that, but not these are long tests. Even at 7+, we're talking about 45-minute papers with short breaks in between, more than one paper. So, these are not the kind of thing that they'll have any experience of at all. So part of your role as an entrance exam tutor, a big part of your role is not just about teaching. A big part of your role is actually preparing them for what they're going to experience on the day. And that comes later in the process, right? But as you get closer to the exam time, you actually have to get your student used to working under timed conditions. You can have a student who does brilliantly well on these papers and can answer all the questions, but it takes them twice as long as they're actually going to be given on the exam. Part of your job is preparing them for that timing, but also preparing them for what's going to happen on that day. I always suggest to parents that I work with that they have their children sit a mock, a proper mock. There's lots of companies in London in particular where there's a large market. There's a lot of companies that you pay for your child to go and do a mock under exam conditions so that they feel what it's like on the day. And I always tell the parents, you're paying for them to fail this mock because they will fail this mock. And you can have students who are really good and they go into this mock and they just bomb because it's the first time they've ever done anything like that. And that's why we do it. So I always say to the parents, don't worry. Don't worry about the result. The whole reason you're paying for this mock is so that they can go in and get all of those nerves out and bomb it, and then we can work on that afterwards.
Yeah.
So and there are places that do them for 11+. There's lots and lots of private companies, all private companies, but there's lots of places that do it for 11+ as well, so that students can actually feel what it's like. If you're working with a family that money is an issue and they can't actually afford to sit one of these because they are pricey, then you can set it up yourself, right? So you can set them a mock to do under exam conditions. It's not going to be the same as sitting in a room full of children, but you can set those kind of timed, pressured experiences so that they feel what that's like without them needing to actually go and pay for that. So there's a couple of different ways of doing that. So
perfect, thank you.
Okay, so the next group of questions was about what does a student need to know when preparing for the entrance exam? Where do I find out more information about entrance exams? Where can I find the resources for teaching? So this is the kind of teaching bit. So the first thing is, I'm very big on research. So do your research, understand what they're going to be sitting, what the papers are like. For grammar schools, it's very transparent. That's the good news. If you're prepping for grammar schools, every borough that is doing it has sample paper. They tell you what exam board. They have their kind of familiarization papers, so you can see exactly what it's all going to look like. You won't know the exact questions, but you can kind of see all of that. And for CEM and GL, there are tons of resources out there that are produced by those companies to prep. So those are easy in terms of where do you find resources. For independent schools, it's different. So, there's they set their own exams, a lot of them, and you have to look at the format of the exam. So just to give you an idea of how different it can be. In my area, I'm in London, and one of the top independent schools that I prep for English for students is called Highgate. And Highgate's comprehension paper is unlike any other paper I've seen anywhere else. They have, so instead of lots and lots of comprehension questions, they have very few, but they are extremely long. They're kind of 9-mark questions that require 2 to 3 paragraphs of written response. They're that PEE style long response. It's very, very different from any other paper. So you need to know that because you're going to need to obviously prepare a student for that style of answer. But remember, we're talking about comprehension, and comprehension is comprehension is comprehension. So in the early stages of teaching, you don't need to worry about the exam format. You need to worry about teaching those fundamental skills. Your student needs to know retrieval, inference, figurative language type questions. These are all the stuff that you're going to be teaching regardless of where they're sitting and what exam. Sorry, I'm talking 11 plus for a moment. But the fundamentals of comprehension are the same. The fundamentals of writing are the same. The fundamentals of math are the same. It doesn't really matter where you're sitting. It's only as you go down that process closer to the exam that you're then honing for that particular paper. So when you're looking for your information and your resources, initially you're looking for comprehension resources, writing resources, reasoning resources, vocabulary resources, they're maths resources. They're not anything special. They don't have to be 11 plus resources. For 7 plus in particular, there's less resources out there for 7 plus than there is for 11 plus. So I use a lot of Twinkl. A lot of Twinkl for my 7
Very
plus
handy.
So because we're talking about teaching the fundamentals at 7 plus, I'm not looking for, at the moment, I know Twinkl doesn't have 7 plus specific resources. That's fine. I don't need 7 plus specific resources till I get much closer to the exam time, and then I'm giving them practice papers. I'm not giving any of my students practice papers at 7 plus, 8 plus, 11 plus until much closer to the exam. They need to be getting exam ready before you're giving those papers. I'm teaching before then, like any other teacher. So I use a lot of Twinkl's resources for 7 plus because they're colorful. They cover the fundamentals of comprehension, etc. I adapt. I hope Beth isn't going to mind me saying I adapt the resources. I teach online exclusively, even my very young students. So what I like about the Twinkl resources is that I can screenshot one part of it, upload that onto my whiteboard. So I might use a short passage that I don't worry about the questions. I just take a screenshot of that little passage. It's up on my whiteboard, and I use that for discussion around, inference or whatever. So I'm on Twinkl a lot for my young students in particular. I know that Twinkl does a lot of 11 plus resources. I personally haven't used them so much, so I'm not going to talk about them just because I don't know them as well. But I'm very pleased to see that there is more out there now. So you don't need exam-specific resources. You need subject-specific resources to teach the skill that you are trying to teach at that moment. And then closer to the time of the exam, obviously you're going to put all of that teaching and skills that they've learned and that knowledge they've learned and hone it for the particular style of paper that student is sitting. And these papers, so just to follow, where do you get the resources? When you reach that point where you need the actual practice papers and practice materials, they're out there for every level, so not free. So that is one thing I will say. So 7 plus, there's lots and lots of companies for 7 plus and 8 plus that produce practice papers that you can purchase. There's 11 plus, there's practice papers. There's also lots of practice books. So you won't find, there are practice books for 7 plus. There are some publishers out there. Beth, can I mention publishers by name?
Yeah, okay, that's fine.
So for 7 plus, there's very few. So for things like reasoning, you can use Bond. Bond does lots of reasoning books that go all the way down to kind of 5-6 years old. CGP do reason that go down to 5-6 years old, and I will recommend those ones for reasoning. I don't feel Bond for English corresponds with the 7 plus exam. It was never meant to. Bond, to be fair to Bond, they didn't design it for 7 plus, they designed it for 11 plus. So the style of questions in the early Bond English books do not correspond well with 7 plus, so I don't tend to use it, but they do have 11 plus books for maths and English. Accolade Press is another publisher that specializes in 7 plus. Really tricky 7. I have to say their stuff is, really only suitable for the top level students, or use the 7 plus for your 8 plus students, because I actually think the level is quite good. So you can or for your early 11 plus. Remember, you might start with an 11 plus student as young as year 3 or year 4. Some of these early resources that we're thinking about for 7 plus, 8 plus are ideal then for those early 11 plus students. So there's loads, Twinkl, of course, but there's loads of other publishers out there who produce these materials. But remember, you don't have to look for exam-specific materials when you start off. You're looking for, how do I teach times tables, right? I need resources for that. How am I going to teach, similes and personification in writing? You're looking for materials for that. They don't have to be specific to exams. So that's my big takeaway for that. You don't need exam-specific materials to teach this stuff. Okay.
Perfect. I think that answers everything in that section as well. As I said, if you do have any other questions, feel free to pop them into the chat as well. I can see someone's asked about it being recorded. Once we finish, this will stay in the group as well, so you will be able to go back and watch it again. We know there's a lot of information as well, so if you do want to go back and rewatch it, it will be staying in the group. You will be able to see it afterwards as well. But yeah, thank you. Do you want to continue, Alana?
Yeah, so the next session is now thinking more about problem solving, I guess. So what to do when time is short before the exam. So what I mean by that is, first of all, what's an ideal period of time to work with a student? I get asked that by parents quite a lot when they come and do a discovery call with me. They kind of want to know when's the ideal time to start. I have my opinion on that, and it's going to vary tutor to tutor. For me, I like to have a year to work with my students. Less than a year is not ideal. So I tend to work primarily for the independent school exams. My exam cycle tends to start, I take on new students in the early January, just as we're doing the second stage of the previous set, and I work with them through to the exam, which for some early schools is November or December or January. So up to a year, basically. Or a year and a half. I mean, I'll go up to a year and a half. It just depends on the student and my schedule. This is for 7+ and 8+. I think it's the ideal amount of time. And if we're thinking about young 7+ students, if you start any earlier than that, they're incredibly young. So, do you want to be starting in reception for a child that's going to then be tested on year 2, year 3 skills, right? It's really young. I actually have a student right now who's 4.5 and in reception, but I'm doing what you might call pre-7+ work. So getting them used to weekly tuition, working on early skills. We're not really focusing on 7+ because it's just too young. So that's my personal view. For 11+, it's a little bit different. So I would certainly advise a parent to start in year 4. I wouldn't start any later. Right. So starting in year 5, I think, is problematic. Its time will be short. I have had students start in year 3. It's a bit early, but there can be reasons. So, I have a student whose English is not their first language, working exclusively from year 3. They're not year 3 anymore, but we've been working from year 3 because that's a real problem area. And we really needed to shore that up, in the run up to the exam. So you can start as early as year 3. I would say year 4 is ideal for 11+, but you're going to get people coming to you later than that. So what do you do when it's not ideal? I've had parents want to start with me 3 months before an exam.
We actually have a question that's just come through.
Great. So
I'll put that one in now. So they've asked, what specific content would you focus on for students who are starting 11+ tutoring now, sitting the exam in September? So yeah, exactly what you're going on to talk about, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not going to give you the answer you want, because the answer I think you want from that is for me to specifically tell you what skills to work on. I'm going to give you a different answer, and I think it's the right answer, obviously. So whatever point a student starts with you on this kind of spectrum, particularly if it's late, you're going to have to assess that student. I can't sit here and say you need to focus on X, Y, and Z, because I've never met your student. I know nothing about them. And you've never, if you've got a student, you've never met them before they start, right? So you have to hit the ground running. And in those first couple of sessions, you're going to need to assess them. You're going to need to get a really good idea of where they are in relation to where they need to be. And where they need to be is going to depend on the exam they're taking as well, and which specific one. So I can't be specific. And that assessment, you might say, okay, well, I'll just send them out a paper, right? I'll send them out a practice paper. They'll send it back to me. Then, I can go from there. So yes, you can do that. I don't think that's enough, personally. You can't tell from a paper what's going on inside a child's mind. So you can look at it and say, okay, well, they didn't really do great on the comprehension, but you're not going to know why. Why didn't they do great on the comprehension? Is it because they're actually not really understanding the passage? They haven't got the vocabulary knowledge, the reading skills, the fluency to be able to understand what's going on in there, and that's what's stopping them answering the questions? Is it because they actually they understood the passage perfectly fine, they've read the questions, and they really don't understand what's required of them from those questions, and that's why their answers are not right? Did they actually understand the passage, understand what's required of them from the question, but have no idea how to go back, look for the right answer, formulate that into an answer? I mean, there are probably something like 6 different skills that go into answering these questions. And unless you know what's causing the problem, looking at a paper and saying, well, they got those wrong, they need to do more comprehension, isn't actually going to help you. So yes, you can send out papers if you find that useful and get them to do that ahead of time, but you need to actually plan some activities in those first sessions that is going to zero in and hone in on those particular skills that they're going to need and work out where the problem areas are, where the gaps are. Once you've done that, and so I'm a big fan of attainment targets. So I have my own attainment targets that I would assess against and find the gaps. I know that Twinkl has some attainment lists, I think, as well. And also you can write your own, right? there's lots of ways of doing it. So once you've worked out those gaps, you're going to have to prioritize, because if you don't have the full amount of time and there are more gaps than there is time, then you're going to have to make some decisions at that point. So you need to literally map it out. I would work out how many sessions do you have between now and the exam time, and break that down. So it's different for every tutor, but maybe you're doing 1 session in English and 1 session in maths a week. How many in English, how many in maths? If you're doing 1 session and you're covering everything, you got only half an hour for each. You're going to have to map that out. So literally map it out, big piece of paper or however you like to do it. I've got this number left, take into account holidays or whatever. And I've got this amount of time and I've got to cover this. Then start mapping it out. I mean, you could, if you're into bits of Post-it notes or whatever, you could literally do this on a big piece of paper, Post-it notes for everything you need to cover, and literally map it out on a timeline, because you're then going to see whether you have time to cover this. And if you don't have time to cover it, that's the point where you start to prioritize your Post-it notes and go, okay, this is what's going to come up most in the exam. This is what's going to be the most important. I have to cover this. I have to spend the time on it. This one is going to be the least number of points. So I'm going to leave that and I'm not going to worry about it. If we have time, great. But if we don't, we don't. And you're going to prioritize then what you've actually got time to cover and what you can then do. And this brings us to a really important point. You have to be honest with the parents. So you can do all of this, but the parents still have an expectation that you're going to cover everything and get them ready for the exam. So honest, open conversations with parents are going to cause you the least problems in the long run. Because a question that comes up, and this isn't on my, but able to relate it to this, it's not on my list, but it is sort of how do you manage parents' expectations, and what do you do if they blame you at the end for not getting into a school? This relates back to this level of open communication. When I work with a student, I work with parents, I have these open conversations with them at the beginning. This is where your child is. This is where they need to get. This is how much time we have. This is how much work is going to be involved. This is what we can cover. But then I also tell them there's no guarantees. Even if we start 1.5 years or 2 years ahead, there's no guarantees. I've had students who've been top in everything, performed extremely well in everything that we do, not got into the school. Last year, there was a 30% increase overall in the number of applicants to these schools. So it's competitive, and it's getting more competitive. They can be top and not get in. So you have to be clear with parents. But it's not to put parents off. So if you think about it, if you want to show parents that you're knowledgeable, you want to show them that you understand what's involved and you're realistic about what can be done. So this goes back to research. If you've done your research, you know your schools, you know the exams, you know what needs to be covered. When you have these conversations with parents, they'll trust you because you're coming from a place of knowledge. I had do I have time for an anecdote here?
Of course.
Okay, so I had a conversation as a parent. I am a parent. Mine are either grown up or I have one at GCSE level right now. So I had a conversation with a tutor yesterday that I was employing for my son in exactly the situation, in that we have 2 months till GCSEs, and this is last minute, right? So I had exactly this from the parent side. I'm slightly more realistic. I was actually put off. I did hire the tutor in there, but I was put off because despite having told the tutor ahead of time which exam board and exam my son was sitting for, he asked me in that session, again, that question, and showed his lack of knowledge because he asked me about a separate exam that doesn't exist for this. So he showed me that actually he wasn't really up on what we were talking about. And I was expecting him to be knowledgeable, right? This is what this discovery call was about. So it put me off slightly. It didn't put me off enough because of our particular situation and I hired him, but it did put me off. And you don't want that to happen with the parents. So when you're having that call, you know, whatever school it is they're going to be trying for, whatever grammar school area, do your preparation, do your research, make sure you know what you're talking about, what's involved in the exam, and you're talking to them from a position of knowledge and confidence. Because then if you're realistic with them, they're not going to take that as a negative. If this tutor had said to me, we've got 8 sessions between now and your son's exam, but I know he's got to cover this and I know this exam, so we're going to focus on this, I've been like, great, right? So it's not about the negativity of saying there's no guarantees and we can't cover everything. It's about saying it from a position of knowledge and confidence.
Perfect. Yeah. And I hope that helps with your question as well, Beck. I hope good luck as well with your student who's starting out now for September. I don't know if it is your first student for the 11 plus or not, but either way, I think it's an exciting journey to go on. So yeah.
Absolutely, it is exciting. And I love, 12 years later, I wouldn't still be doing this if I didn't actually love entrance exam tuition. I could tutor other subjects. I don't have to do entrance, right? I'm an English specialist more so, and I've done other things, but I like it. There's a challenge. There's an energy that comes with entrance exam tuition. You're all on the same page, working towards this goal. And yes, it's incredibly high stakes, the goal at the end, but you're working together. And that's certainly how I view it. I work with families in conjunction with them, helping them, supporting them on this journey.
Perfect. We have had another question linking to this about when a child first starts with you and they're in year 4, how would you go about structuring those sessions? So
again, it comes
to the end.
Well,
more time.
You do have more time, but sometimes that feels almost more problematic because you've got 2 years stretching in front of you, or less than 2 years, depending on the exam. But when you sort of think, well, what am I going to do in all that time? But remember, we are teachers. I know we're talking about tutoring for a specific exam, but we are all teachers. I'm assuming everybody who's watching this is a teacher of some kind or another. So what are you going to do for this? You're going to teach, right? What are you going to teach? You're going to teach English, maths, or whatever it is you've been hired. Sometimes you're not doing everything. So a tutor might be hired just to do English or just to do math, but whatever it is you're teaching, you are teaching that. You don't lose sight of the fact that that's all you're actually doing. You're teaching that subject. You've got to teach it with the exam in mind. So you're teaching at the level that child is at. So if we're talking about a year 4 child, for instance, and I've got a year 4 child that I'm prepping in English for 11 plus. So for a year 4 child, you're going to cover English. I'm going to assume it's English for a minute. You're going to cover comprehension, and you're going to cover writing, you're going to cover vocabulary, you're going to cover SPAG. How do you do that? I can tell you how I do it. Everybody's different in what they do. But what I would tend to do in a session is split the session up a little bit. I always start with something that is a little bit fun. So anybody who knows me kind of outside of this knows that my teaching style is all about fun and games, because I work with a lot of young students. So, and the entrance exam process is arduous and can be challenging. So it's our job to not make it so. and to do that, I bring in a lot of fun and games. But the fun and games are all relevant to what we're doing. And by the way, Twinkl is fabulous for this. So where do I get most of my games from? It is Twinkl, because there's a lot on there that is brilliant for, I just, again, screenshot not on screen. So I would start with something icebreakerish, short, fun, just a few minutes, right? Something to get us into the mood. And in English, I use a lot of story dice is a great one. There's an online, if you're teaching, so you can physically, I've got, sorry, I'll pull them out. I don't teach in person anymore, but from my days of teaching in person, I've still got loads and loads of resources. These are literal dice. Oops, I'm going to drop them with pictures on. right? And you roll the dice and you make stories. I think there are templates even on Twinkl, I think, where you can make your own from cardboard. I like these feel lovely. I like the sort of physicality of these and the sound they make. There's a free on-screen version from the same company. Story Dice, I think, is the name of the company. I'm trying to think who it is. But anyway, so if you're teaching online, you literally roll the dice on screen. So you could do something like that. There's lots of great Twinkl games that are board games that I use with vocabulary and things like that. Anything that is a quick, relevant to the topic, but quick, fun activity to get us in the mood. Often you're teaching a student after they've been at school all day. They're not in the mood, right? So there's just that reconnection. Then for comprehension, for a year 4 student, you want a passage that is appropriate to that level of that particular child. Again, if I'm on screen, I have it up on the screen and we read and then talk about that passage. Controversially now, but I don't do any writing. Not even for my older, year 5 students in the session. I see absolutely no need for it. I think it wastes time. Time is always pressured, and it doesn't add any value for me in the session. So if I'm doing comprehension, we have a passage, we're reading it, we're discussing it. So we're talking about all of those types of things, inference, vocabulary, everything, but we're doing it through discussion, okay? Yes, you need to see the students' written answers, but that's homework, right? They can do that in their own time in homework and you can look at it after. If I'm doing creative writing, I might use for a year 4 student, I might use a picture prompt. Again, love the pictures on Twinkl with the keywords. Those are my particular favorites, is the story prompts that are pictures that have a list of keywords at the side that you can get on Twinkl, because we'll then obviously be talking about vocabulary and synonyms and, using these words in our story. So you're encompassing lots of things within that, learning new words. So picture prompts, and then thinking about telling the story. I do a lot of storytelling, right? Because waiting for student to write, waste of time. So we can do it. I scribe sometimes onto the screen. So if we want to actually physically see, I will type it onto the screen so that the student can then work on it. We can look at it and think, okay, what could we do differently and what can we add or rework, whatever. So those types of activities is what I would still do with a year 4. Absolutely same thing. Maths, it's going to depend on your year 4. You're going to need to push them beyond what they're doing at school. So whatever areas they're having trouble in, you're going to work on, but you're also going to push them beyond. You can't wait for the school and go at the school's pace, or you won't cover everything. So you're going to need to take those next steps and push them beyond. Does that answer the question?
Hopefully. I can't see the name of the person that posted that question. You're just coming up as a Facebook user, but I hope that answered your question for you as well. So thank you, Alana.
Okay, so that takes us to the last section of questions, which is kind of the business side of entrance exam tutoring. So my favorite question, which comes up all the time: how on earth do you break into this market if you haven't been in this market? It's this vicious circle of, you want to be an entrance exam tutor, but you haven't been an entrance exam tutor. So parents want someone with experience. So you go round in this circle. What do you actually do? And trust me, it's absolutely possible to do. So yes, parents generally are going to ask you and are looking for somebody who's got success on these exams, particularly for the more competitive schools. Have you got a child into X school? That's going to be one of the first questions they ask you in the discovery call. And it is tricky, but it is possible to navigate these conversations. And it comes back to what I've been talking about before, about knowledge and confidence. So you have to answer honestly, and the honest answer is going to be, no, I haven't got a student into that particular school, but, and make sure you go straight into the but before they get a chance to say anything else. And what you want to do is have researched these schools that they're asking you about and have that knowledge of something very specific for that school. So to give you an example, in London, the top 2 really boys' schools, private boys' schools, St Paul's and Westminster are the ones that are always most sought after. So St Paul's has a multiple choice format for their exams, and for 7+, they have a very unusual element. They don't do story writing in the written exam, but they do dictation, where you're actually listening to sentences and the student has to write them down, listening out for all the spelling and grammar, things like that. So these are unique for this school. So I know that. So if I had a parent, so I have actually got students into St Paul's, but if I was tackling this as a tutor who hadn't, I would say, no, I haven't. But what you have to know about St Paul's is they're a little bit different to other schools. So they don't do the creative writing in the first stage, they do it in the second stage. Instead, they've got this dictation. So what we're really going to have to work on is those grammar, spelling, and listening skills. That's going to be really important for your child. So what you've done is you've answered the question really honestly, but you've then immediately shown the parent that you have the knowledge about that school. You know what you need to do with that child, and you're demonstrating how you're going to do that to them. They're not interested if you've got 25 years of teaching behind you. Doesn't matter. They're interested in what you know about the entrance exams. So I often see, ads and things from tutors or things out there where they say, experienced teacher, 20 years, whatever. Great. But that's irrelevant to entrance. It's not actually irrelevant. Obviously, we're all great teachers because of it. From the parent's perspective, it's irrelevant. So if you've done your research and you have the knowledge and you know how you're going to apply that, and you show the parent that in that conversation, they are going to have that confidence in you then to go forwards. Will every parent? No, there's going to be parents who are uninterested in saying, no, I only want somebody with experience. But if you can gain their trust in that first conversation and do it by phone or Zoom. I know we all, I'm old, I'm 50 and remember the days before WhatsApp and all the rest of it. But I'm a big believer that you need to talk to the parent, talk directly to them, move away from, fine, make the contact via email or whatever initially, but then set up a time to talk to them. I'll give you an example of how this works for me. So I'm well known in the market now, and people come to me for tuition because they've heard about me. So I set up, so they'll contact me via email or text if someone's passed on my number to them, whatever. I set up a discovery call with them. The very first thing they say to me, particularly for these young children, is we want a face-to-face tutor. I haven't taught face-to-face for years, right? So I'm online only. So they come in saying, I want X. And in the case of answering this question, they come, they're going to come to you thinking they want somebody who has experience of this school. They walk out having hired me as an online tutor for their 4-year-old because I give them that confidence that I know what I'm doing during that call. Could I do that as well by email? I don't think so. I think you need to make that personal connection and show them who you are and what you can do through that conversation. And what they came in wanting and what they go out wanting aren't necessarily going to be the same thing then.
I think also in that situation, they've met you online and actually they can see, if it is via Zoom rather than a phone call, they can see your personality, can't they? Because I think that's, with all tutors, that's part of it, is do you and that child work well together? And I think by actually seeing you or hearing you, they can sometimes tell if they think you'll be a good match for their child.
Absolutely, because you're selling yourself, remember. You think you're selling your teaching. Well, tutors think that what they're selling is their experience and knowledge as a teacher, but actually you're not. You're selling yourself. You're selling you. So the best way to sell you is for them to actually see you and talk to you. So I really encourage you towards those first phone calls or Zoom if you can do that when you're talking to these parents. You're much more likely to break into the market that way. So the second way, so that's one thing, obviously. The second way is actually making sure that you gain some experience in a different way. Okay, so we've said, you haven't got any experience with a child from that school. You haven't got any experience getting a child in at 11 plus or whatever. Okay, but you can gain experience in other ways. I'm going to plug myself for just a second here, Beth. But when I started 12 years ago, there was no way of breaking into the market except by just trial and error. Literally, I was thrown into a 7+ situation by an agency, and I had no idea what I was doing. I knew nothing about it. And I spent many years honing my skills and gaining that knowledge and whatever. You can do that. Absolutely. It worked for me, right? But it took a long time. But there is now another way, and I provide that other way. So this is I'll only give this plug once. So I set up a program specifically for tutors who want to break into this market rather than be thrown into it. They've made that decision. They actually want to be an entrance exam tutor. It appeals to them for lots of reasons. And let's not beat around the bush. It is a higher paying tuition. Because of the high stakes at the end, the rates you command are higher. I'm not saying go into it for the money, because you need to actually like what you're doing as well. But if you do like the idea of it, there is a good return from it as well. So you can then consider actually fast tracking your way into it by doing some of I do modules in all of these areas. So you can actually do this training, get the knowledge and skills you need, so that you can have those conversations with parents and hit the ground running, all the attainment targets, all of those sorts of things I provide. So you can do it that way. And then you can have a conversation with parents and actually say, I've trained in this, right? I haven't got a child into that particular school, but I know all of this about that school, and I've trained to become an entrance exam tutor. So that's another way of breaking into the market. I think that answered that question.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, and we're just under the hour mark, so I think we're going to keep in time as well, which is great. But if anybody has any other questions, feel free to post them in the comments now. As I said before, there is a slight delay with them coming through, so if you have just posted one, I'm sure we'll see it in a second. But if you are watching this back at a later date, if you're not watching it live, please feel free to still ask your questions. You can comment them on the post, and we will keep monitoring it so that if any questions do come up, Alana will be able to answer those as well. And I hope that I'm not dropping you in it here, but she's more than happy for you to contact her if you do have those specific questions.
So let me give you a few different ways. So absolutely put them on the Twinkl group and I'll answer them on there. You can join. I have a community for people who want to be entrance exam tutors, free community, Facebook community. So everybody is welcome to join that. Don't leave Twinkl, right? You could be in both. Be in Twinkl, it's wonderful, but also you can join this it's specific to entrance exam tuition. So I'll put a link. I can't possibly remember the name of it off the series of numbers for the Facebook group, but I'll put a link onto this chat afterwards. So you're welcome in there. You don't have to be an entrance exam tutor. You just have to have an interest in and thinking about it to join that group. And you can ask questions in there as well. You can visit my website, which is very easy to remember, becomeanentranceexamtutor.co.uk. It does what it says on the tin, right? Anyone remember
a nice, easy web address.
I remember that commercial, Ron Seal, it does what it says on the tin. Oh, that's on my website. So you can contact me through there. There's a contact form on there as well. And I just want to plug, I have a free YouTube channel. So I was showing you those story dice. So I love all of this physical stuff, all of these games. So I started to make some YouTube videos of how to use this. Like, how do you use the story dice in a session? How do you use maths dice? All of these specific to entrance exam tuition. And it just built up over time. So there's now like a whole bunch of videos on there, and they're all related to little games, little icebreakers that you can do with your students. So I'll put a link to that YouTube channel afterwards as well. So you can just kind of watch these and think, oh, I'll use that in my next session. And if you haven't got the resources, well, some of them you'll recognize from Twinkl for sure. Some of the games and things, but if you haven't got the resources like the story dice and things, I bet you Twinkl does.
There are definitely some versions out there. Oh, perfect. So if there are any links that you want to get or that you can't find, put them in the comments, and I know Alana can follow this up as well and give you any links that you're needing to find as well. But thank you so much for joining us today. It's been absolutely fantastic and so much information. So I'm sure I won't be the only person that needs to watch it back again to take all of the information in. But thank you so much for joining us.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
You.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.